in For those of you who were here last week, you might recall the sermon brought by Emily Mace, our guest worship leader. Her topic was how the light lands, and it drew a deep and nuanced metaphor from light passing through stained glass windows. Just as the spots of light streaming from the many-colored panes illuminate in delightful ways and create beautiful images, can the different threads of belief we each bring into our congregation combine as an engaging and wonderful tapestry of meaning and understanding. Emily argued that we, those who receive the light, are the critical factor in deciding whether this matters. Emily's message contained much more, but this is the imagery that most stuck with me. As she prepared for the service, Emily and I shared information, mostly so that I could prepare the order of service and arrange accompaniment for the hymns. And initially, she planned to share a fairly poignant reading drawn from the book A Cathedral of the World by the Reverend Forrest Church. This described the natural play of light through gaps in the treetops and the movement and dancing play of the light rays and how they enliven and enchant the world below. This felt sacred and evoked the sense of a cathedral, and hence the title. The reading was a perfect complement to her sermon, except as Emily looked a little further, she ran into a problem. She learned that Forrest Church himself was in some way tainted in that he had transgressed ethical boundaries and violated his ministerial covenant on multiple occasions. In short, he was a philanderer. He engaged in numerous extramarital affairs, including some with congregants in the church he served. So what Emily faced was sort of a Me Too moment. The reading she had selected was perfect, but the author was flawed. Should she bring it to us here at Beverly? Well, I'll get back to Emily's quandary in a bit, but first I'm going to step aside and discuss the Reverend Dr. Forrest Church. He was a UU icon. I don't know if his name is familiar to most of you, but his background was distinguished and his pedigree was pure. He was the son of the U.S. Senator Frank Church, did his undergraduate work at Stanford, got clerical training at Harvard Divinity, and a PhD in church history at Harvard University. He became a very prominent minister. His last position, serving the Unitarian Church of All Souls in New York City, lasted for 30 years, and it ended only upon his death from cancer in 2009. He was a prolific writer and one of the few Unitarian Universalists of his generation that might be viewed as a true theologian. He was well known beyond UU circles also, largely because he touched the larger world with a popular and respected newspaper column that was syndicated by the Chicago Tribune and thus appeared all over the country. His column dealt with important political and ethical issues in an insightful, liberal manner. Among UU clergy, he was quite important and influential. But he was also a human being and had flaws. He was somewhat arrogant, as too many of the very successful and brilliant people might be. And more of a problem, he was a philanderer. He had been married to his wife, Anne, since college days, and they had 2 children. She was also a Unitarian Universalist, and at All Souls, which is in probably the richest community where any Unitarian church is, she worked as the director of religious education and was beloved and well regarded in the congregation. We knew that Forrest engaged in romantic entanglements during this time, but none imposed publicly on his ministry. So it just joined the realm of sort of well-kept secrets, things spoken in hushed tones, or things not known. That changed in 1990 when he began an ardent affair with a congregant who had come to him for marriage counseling. This new relationship was more than a passing affair. And in 1991, he announced to the congregation that he and Amy would be divorced. No reason was given. However, churches are hard places to keep secrets, and the nature of his affair with the new woman soon became public, causing an uproar. Forrest seemed to feel that this was his own business and continued to minister with both his ex-wife and his soon-to-be new wife, both in the same congregation. Now, this whole thing violates so many aspects of ministerial ethics and guidelines. We are taught to avoid situations that allow our personal lives to compromise our role and integrity as professional clergy, and to avoid situations that might be disruptive to our church community. Romantic involvement with a congregant is a big bozo no-no, even without it being an extramarital affair. When and if breaches do occur, and ministers are human, they might fall in love with someone, our guidelines suggest that the preferred course is for both parties, minister and their new husband, to remove themselves and move on, probably to another church. But the thing with Forrest Church was an earthquake in the life of All Souls Church. Both Forrest and Amy were well regarded and loved, and members felt all of the things you might expect: betrayal, anger, pain, loss, on and on. The issue was raised and a vote of confidence was held over Forrest's ministry, with 136 people voting to remove him and 370 voting to affirm his ministry. This is a bigger church than ours. There's about 500 people. So it translates into about a 75% vote of confidence in spite of these events. And I have no idea what happened to Amy at this time. I can't tell you that. Usually a minister won't accept a call without a minimum of 90% support to avoid fostering a schismatic church environment. But Forrest Church decided to remain at All Souls, and he served there almost another 20 years. He did have to face an ethics panel from the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association, which pretty much slapped his wrist for his malfeasance. And the denomination itself, although it had the power to do so, took no action. The whole thing sort of passed into history. About 100 members did quit All Souls Church over this issue, but the church and Forrest Church's ministry mostly thrived, at least on the surface. We wouldn't even be talking about this today, except possibly as a cautionary tale based on a high-profile case of clergy misbehavior. And these things do happen. Clerical malfeasance is an unfortunate thing, and it is not rare. We are in a position where we have extensive access into people's lives and their emotions. And some people think we have authority. Do I have authority? Who knows? However, the women haven't been throwing themselves at me in any of the 3 congregations I've served. Either that or I'm just not perceptive. But in 2017, and this is, I said, 8 years after he died, and almost 25 years after the events we were just talking about occurred, the climate that had mostly allowed sexual malfeasance to be swept under the rug changed dramatically. And this coincided with the Me Too movement and a new energy for naming and shaming abuse. It affected me directly at the Meadville Seminary here in Chicago. The school had just obtained a very generous sum of money to endow the annual Forrest Church Convocation Week at the beginning of each academic year. After all, he was one of the biggest names in Unitarian Universalism. This is a big event, prominent speakers and special classes, and they even fed us. It was maybe the one time when our local UU seminary felt like a big league institution. However, given the legacy of Reverend Church and our new sensibility to sexual misbehavior, the demand arose to drop Church's name from the event. He was someone we did not feel comfortable honoring in that way. His work, maybe. The man, no. The school responded. The convocation was ended. I do know they attempted to see if we could keep the money. And I'm glad I wasn't Meadville's president, who had the task of calling his widow to see if we could. She administered the funding source. If we could continue using it without using Forrest's name. That was a big no. This was almost 20 years after everything had happened at All Souls. It took that long and a shift in public morality for this situation to catch up with our UU culture. Our organizations are finally owning up to a past that involved too much malfeasance, mostly bullying behavior or inappropriate sexual conduct. But we can only respond in cases where we know what happened. And there is still a pattern where congregations and their leadership like to keep their own dirty laundry hidden. I must acknowledge that the huge growth in the number of female ministers has helped in this regard. However, it's not just the old boys network that needs to be held accountable. One, and I'll call this a sign of progress, is that there are now also a few female ministers who have been removed from fellowship for malfeasance as well. It's ironic that this is progress. So let's return to Emily Mace and the problem she had last week. She found out that Forrest Church was tainted and didn't know whether it was appropriate to read from his book before her sermon here. Emily and I discussed the situation at some length, and I responded to her in a way that's quite typical of me, with very clear and direct moral guidance. My email said to her, Emily, you can use Forrest Church with or without disclaimer, or you can drop Forrest Church with or without explanation. All of these outcomes have merit, and I leave it to your own sensibility and discretion. As you might know, Emily did choose to drop the reading, although she did include a hymn that was based on his words, written by somebody else. There is a real question here, though, and it's not a new question, but it comes up more frequently these days. When do you ignore good work because the author was flawed? How much is character an issue when what you are accessing is not their personality, but their brilliance? And how do we evaluate them? On belief, on politics, on identity, behavior? Now, I deal with this problem in my life in inconsistent ways. I personally would have had no problem reading passages from Forrest Church's work, and I might do so in the future. And in fact, his words will be our closing words today. In my mind, his brilliance exceeds his failings, so I will go there, and I can treat it independently from his transgressions, which should always be named and known. On the other hand, I have not watched a Woody Allen movie since he got weird with the young woman who had been his adopted daughter. His genius on film, in my eyes, it's inextricably intertwined with his lived life. And I just can't trust or accept his art any longer. So I'll go both ways on this question. Underlying this is a complex moral and ethical issue about what is right, and in particular, what and who is the arbiter of free speech. I had actually planned a very different sermon here this morning before I got sidetracked into the Forrest Church thing, and I might get to it on another day, as we face many questions about suppression of speech, censorship, and what is free speech. What are the guidelines we follow? The public arguments about transparency, accountability, and truth are everywhere. We deal with cancel culture, deplatforming, and revisionist history now every day. And we need to be more sophisticated in how we understand the underlying issues. I have no idea what the limits are of who we would allow to speak here at Beverly Unitarian Church. That's a bridge we haven't really crossed yet. We haven't had the offer from people who might be very questionable. But that's not today. Today I wish to close out on something closer to home. As we attest to the inherent worth and dignity of every person. We declare ourselves to be radically welcoming and tell people, whatever your past or present is like, you are welcome here. We claim to hold no doctrine or dogma and to accept others without tests of belief. We also claim that we aspire to free and open discussion while maintaining an envelope of safety and caring. These are lofty statements, and we do believe that this is what we are and what we are trying to do in our church community. But there's some inherent tension between these different things. We know now that there have to be exceptions. Safe discussions cannot take place if people behave with aggression, hostility, or ad hominem attack. Similarly, we cannot abide with disruptive or violent action. These things would keep us from providing the safety and welcome we promise. So our acceptance of others is bounded, and for the most part, we hold the limits of what is acceptable in our gut and not in policy. It's our intuitive and emotional reaction, not a coherent understanding. And sometimes things get messy. I was just reading about another church where the minister had met and decided to allow a recent sex offender to attend services and work to become part of the church community. This was quite well intended by all parties, and the person in question showed great remorse about their past behaviors, was engaged in both legal monitoring and private therapy, and they really believed they needed engagement with healthy others to continue on their own path to rehabilitation and mental health. Not surprisingly, their personal history was one of pain and sexual abuse by family members. The minister felt that this is what churches are for, to help people repair themselves in the embrace of a loving and supportive community. The person's status was not announced at the start, and when word got out, because word always gets out, all hell broke loose. Parents complained that they had been allowed to expose their kids to a threat and a danger without warning. Some congregants lost trust in the church and its leadership. Others, however, felt that the decisions were correct. And within a short time, a fault line divided this congregation. Most simply described, it was a rift between those who saw this issue as one of helping and compassion, and those who saw this issue as one of safety and well-being. Both are real concerns, and this is true. We do see things differently. It took years of meetings and intervention by experts and time, endless meetings to help heal this congregation, to break down the fears, and to repair this divide. Eventually, they came up with very clear guidelines about how such a person should be received, including things like always having a friendly escort and restriction from some activities, particularly those involving kids. Now, if this sounds somewhat distant, and it is, I can also tell you that it's not. I had an extended series of discussions with a man that Illinois has listed and categorized as a sex offender because he wanted to attend our church. We never got to the point of deciding whether and how to proceed because he finally decided that the procedures the state insisted on created sufficient barriers to prevent him from coming. And I won't go into that whole story at all. I didn't work too hard to challenge this, though, but not because he was a registered offender, but because I believed he was looking for things in a church that were not really what we had to offer. But I would have worked hard to get him included if he had chosen to come. The sex offender example is somewhat extraordinary, but very real. The church in question, in the story I just told, concluded, the goal of safety does not have to be at odds with compassion and justice. As long as we let our abhorrence and anger blind us to what the problem of child sexual abuse really looks like and how pervasive it is, we may be the biggest obstacle in both keeping ourselves and our children safe from potential predators, and in grappling with UU theology at one of its hardest places. Things are hard, things are messy. All I can say is, amen and blessed be. I don't know if you understood my instruction here. Okay. In our hymnal, there's 3 separate